Hello, it's Jeta, and this video is the first of a three-part series of how I revised for my A-level subjects. So if you don't know who I am, for anyone new, I am 18, just finished my A-levels and about to start my psychology degree at the University of Bath, but I did just take the A-levels psychology, English literature and history. So today I thought I would dive into psychology, my favourite subject, but also, funnily enough, the subject that I think I spent most time revising out of the three. Just because psychology is such a content heavy subject. For me at least, psychology was definitely an upward struggle. In year 12 I was sort of getting C's in my papers and slowly worked my way up to getting A's and A stars, and in the end I got an A overall. The first thing I want to talk about is just summarising the content. You will learn a lot of stuff in psychology, from theories to studies and experiments. You're just going to have so much content, and it is going to be impossible to learn every little crevice of information that you're given. So you really do need to summarise the content first, as you do with most subjects. What I would say for psychology is use the specification to find out the core information that you actually need to know, because for psychology the spec is your lifeline, because even when you look at the exam papers, the questions are literally taken word for word from the spec. So everything that you're going to be tested on is based on the spec. So if you know that really well, then you're going to be fine. So yeah, before I even go into the format of my revision resources, I did just want to touch on what you actually need to include in your summary notes. And as I said, go through the spec, make sure that you're covering every theory you need to cover, and examples for each of those theories, like real life examples, can be useful, and also as well as what the theories are. So I want to get up, just going to pull up the spec for social influences, but let's say you're looking at minority influence, including reference to consistency, commitment and flexibility. You need to know what each of those terms means, and then it would be good to also have an example. So for example, for minority influence, you can use the example of the suffragettes or something like that, and like how they did each of those things. So that's just knowing the theories, but then you also need to have studies and experiments for each spec point. So make sure that you do have 2 to 3 studies for each bullet point, and sometimes you need to have 2 to 3 for like little bits of the bullet point as well, if it's like particularly content heavy. And the last thing I think you should include in your content summary revision resources, whatever those would look like, is evaluation points. So let's say you're looking at attachment and you're looking at Bowlby's theory of attachment. As well as knowing the theory, having studies for it, also have evaluation points for the theory and evaluation points for the studies for the theory, if that makes sense. Essentially, instead of thinking the evaluation points through when you're doing the questions and essays, just have the evaluation points as part of your notes, because that way you're constantly thinking about evaluation, which you will need to do in your exam. And I will go through what kinds of evaluation you should be including later in the video. The second thing I want to talk about is making your revision resources. So I just went through what to actually include in your revision resources, and now I'm just going to talk about the format of them. So I personally made Quizlet flashcard sets for all of the content. So for each topic, let's say aggression, I would have a folder on Quizlet, and then inside I'd have a flashcard set for each bullet point in the specification, and I'd phrase all of the flashcards as questions. I think I'll just get up my Quizlet so I can show you what I'm sort of talking about. So for example, what is disinhibition? And then I'd have the answer with the sort of key words or phrases in bold. But then I also wanted to just show you that for studies, I'd also have these on here. So I'd split them up into aim, method, results, conclusion, and either implications or evaluations depending on the type of study. So yeah, with these flashcards I would just go through them again and again and again. I'd sometimes get someone else to test me on them. I also later on, like closer to exam season, me and one of my friends who also took psychology would just sit down and sort of test each other and talk through the flashcards. So they were just really helpful, especially because they were in question format, and they were kind of my summary notes. Like those flashcards were my lifeline, and they were so helpful for psychology, and they are on Quizlet. It is free to access, so I will put the link to my Quizlet down below, and you can use my psychology flashcards if you would wish to, because I spent my entire sixth form time making these flashcards as like perfect as I could. And I didn't actually finish every single topic on there. I think for some of the topics it didn't really work very well, like issues and debates, but I do have most topics on there completed. But whilst I started out with just these Quizlet flashcards, I very quickly realised whilst the theories and the general knowledge was going into my head really quickly using these Quizlet flashcards, the only thing that was not going into my head were the studies and experiments. So I had to think of a way to learn these better, and the other revision resources that was invaluable to me were these study tables that I made. So basically down the side I have the spec points. So for example, this is aggression. I'll use biopsychology because that's the universal topic, but I would have like localization, lateralization, like circadian rhythms, ultradian rhythms, like all the different spec point topics. Then I'd have the researcher's name here. Then I would have the aim, method, results, conclusion, evaluation. So that's what they looked like. And the reason why these worked so well is that not only was I able to have like an overall viewpoint of all the studies that I needed to know for that topic, well, that I chose to learn, because there were many more studies that I was taught, but I just tried to keep it to the minimum. But also I made sure that I had enough studies for each of the spec points. So for localization, I could see that I had 3. For brain plasticity, I had 3, and so you can be sure that you're learning enough. But with these, what I would do is I would either just blurt out the studies that I could remember and then use this to check, or I would just give this to my mum and like ask her to just test me. So she'd just be like localization, and I just give her the 3 studies. So yeah, these are really useful, and I made them for all of the topics. I had loads of these. The last revision resource, which isn't really a resource I made, but I just printed out the specification and stuck it on the door of my fridge, and I would basically just ask my family like members to just point to a bullet point on the spec and just get me to explain it to them with like evaluation and a study, or I would just do it at the dinner table, like just explain one of the spec points. In general, I think that conversation can be one of the best ways of revising for psychology, and I really haven't heard this like recommended, but if you can explain a theory to someone else, then you clearly understand it for yourself. And if you're struggling, then you don't get it quite yet, so you need to go back and understand it better for yourself. But also, conversation sort of naturally gets you to evaluate what you're saying. So yeah, explain parts of the course to your family, explain it to your other psychology classmates as well. Whenever one of us didn't understand something, we'd explain it to them, and then when you didn't understand something, someone would explain it to you. And it's just such a great way to revise. So yeah, that was 2 things actually. Stick your specification on your fridge, get your family to pick things for you to explain, but also just in general, explain things to people, have conversations about what you're learning in psychology. Because I feel like the topics that I had conversations about were the ones that I remembered most in the exam. Okay, so I thought I would also quickly talk about practicing and actually putting your knowledge into practice. So, apart from research methods, I would say doing a whole psychology paper maybe isn't the best way to spend your time, only because like very niche parts of the course are going to come up, so you will only have tested those niche parts. And whilst yes, of course, later on do some practice papers just to get used to the timing, I think what's better in terms of practice is write out every possible essay. Either write it out or just plan it in detail. But how you can basically write every possible essay is just go through the specification. So for example, going back to social influences, just because I've got it here, conformity to social rules as investigated by Zimbardo can be an essay. Explanations for obedience, both agentic state and legitimacy of authority could sort of be a separate 8 marker, but maybe not. And then like situational variables can be a 16 marker. Dispositional explanations can be a 16 marker. Sometimes there's like multiple per spec point, but just go through the specification, throw in the command words, describe and evaluate or discuss, and then the like wording from the spec, and there you go. You've basically planned every essay that could come up. The only thing that you could do also is that sometimes they'll ask you like to discuss research into one of those spec points, so you can also plan those. But yeah, I'm not saying you're gonna have time to do every single one, but if you start early you might. And what I did is towards the end I just wrote out the essays. So for example, this is for memory. I just did one for the multi-store model, I did one for capacity, duration and encoding, I did one for long-term memory, one for the working memory model, and I just went through the spec points and did loads and loads of essays. I did that for what's it called, psychopathology. I did essays. So yeah, the reason why I say that you could do this instead of doing a full exam paper is because the reason why I say to sort of do these essays instead of all the short questions nearer to the end is because you are revising all the content by doing the essay questions, because those are the most amount of content they would ask. So kind of by planning a 16 marker, you have the knowledge you need for an 8 marker, you have the knowledge you need for a 4 marker and a 2 marker. You're just reducing the amount of what you're putting in, if that makes sense. Leading off from that, I thought I would talk a little bit about exam technique. So the biggest thing I would say is understand what the command words mean. And what I mean by the command words are just the words that tell you what to do. So for example, discuss this, or state this, or describe and evaluate, blah blah blah. Those command words tell you what you need to write, essentially. And my teacher made us do this so many times, but there's a list of command words on the exam board website. I will link it down below if I remember to, but what she made us do is just define each of those command words in like common English. So what does discuss mean? Like, what do they want from you when they say discuss? What does describe mean? What does evaluate mean? What does comment mean? And all these different words. And then once you do know what these words mean, when you're in the exam, get 2 different color highlighters. Use one for the command word and one for the content, so what they're actually asking, so that you know how much / the structure of what you need to answer, and then what knowledge you need to recall. And it's as easy as that. When it's the time pressure of the exam, you are going to be tempted to just leave the highlighters and just go. I did it for every single question. I would highlight, and honestly it was worth the maybe couple of seconds that it added on to my time, because it made a difference in my marks. Because misunderstanding what the question's asking is what me and most of my classmates miss the most marks on at the very start of the course, and those are just such silly marks to lose. Sometimes people would even misunderstand a 16 marker. That's 16 marks gone. Like, that's a lot to lose. So I really recommend that you use the highlighting method and actually do what the questions are asking you. The last little piece of advice for exam technique is very specific to like 2, 3 or 4 mark questions. Sometimes when you've written out your answer and you've like finished with all the content and you don't know what else to say, but you know it's too short for the amount of writing you need for that kind of mark question, sometimes add an example, because that's what's missing. So now moving on to how to structure the essay questions. This is the part of psychology that took me the longest to get. I took 2 other essay subjects, and for some reason psychology essays just didn't click for me. I just didn't get it. And I think when I had my epiphany moment of how to actually structure and write 16 mark essays in psychology, that was the moment that my marks started going up and my grades started going up, and everything just made sense and everything clicked into place of why we even evaluate and why we bother with all this stuff about mundane realism and ecological validity and population validity, blah blah blah, because it goes on forever and ever and you feel like you're repeating yourself so much. So yes, I'm hoping that I can give you your epiphany by explaining how I structured my essays. But part of my epiphany came from another video on YouTube where this woman kind of explained how to do the essays, and I will link that down below because that was really helpful, but I will give some of my tips as well. So if the essay question is a discuss research question, then you only talk about methodological evaluation. So things like mundane realism and ecological validity, the sample, so the size, is it large, is it small, what does that say, what does that mean, is it a male or female sample, the type of study, so is it an experiment or is it a case study or whatever, replicability, so how easy is the study able to be replicated by other psychologists, reliability, so have other studies found the same thing, stuff like this. So that is all the evaluation you would put in a discuss research essay, and it's a bit simpler, and at least for me these essays tended to be a bit shorter because you have a bit less to say. You would use a lot more studies in this essay, so I would say at least sort of 3 studies in this essay, maybe even 4, but you're really going into detail and evaluating the methodology of the research, which means experiments, case studies, meta-analyses, these kind of things. But then you have another second type of essay question, which will be to discuss a theory. So they'll be like, discuss the situational explanation for regression, or discuss brain plasticity. And for a theory, there's a lot more evaluation to choose from. So the first thing that I would put in these kind of essays is evidence and studies. So I would put in a study or 2 and say, these are valid studies, which shows that this theory has evidence to support it, which makes the theory more valid in turn. So you're not evaluating the evidence, you're not evaluating the study or experiment, you're not doing that. You might in brief show how it's strong evidence by saying that it has ecological validity, all of these things, but you don't waffle on about that at all. You immediately link it back to the theory and you say, because this is strong evidence, it shows that the theory is valid because it has all this great evidence to support it. Then after you've done that, you quickly move on and add in more evaluation points that are very separate to the research. You can leave the studies now and move on to stuff that's more interesting. So bring in debates or approaches, things like nature versus nurture, reductionism or holism, free will determinism. A really easy one to put in is normothetic versus ideographic. Most theories are normothetic. Things like models, like the working memory model, multi-source model, that's normothetic. You're applying a theory to a larger group of people with no sort of consideration of individual differences. Most theories are normothetic, very few are ideographic that I can even think of. So putting in like the fact that it's normothetic is a really good evaluation point. You can just throw it in and say it doesn't take into account individual differences, so it may not be sort of applicable to every single person, but at the same time normothetic theories equal treatments that can be created and spread towards everyone. So yeah, things like that kind of evaluation. And then for approaches, you can talk about which approach it comes from and the evaluations that come with that approach. So that's quite good because it means that what you learned in approaches, where you've learned like the criticism of each approach, you just take those criticisms and apply them to the theory because each theory sort of comes from an approach. But yeah, debates and approaches I think can be difficult to implement sometimes, and you have to really get the debate and really get the approach to pull them in. But you can avoid pulling in any debates or approaches, and instead you can do this. You can talk about implications. So what does this mean for the economy? What does it mean for the NHS? All of these different things. Sometimes even ethical implications can be included. The other really easy thing that you can put into your essay is real world applications. So does this theory, has it led to a change in law? Has it led to a change in education? Has it led to a change in the general social behaviour? So yeah, those are all the points that you can add into your essay. But now just some general tips, overall tips for the essay itself. I think one thing to say is rather than saying loads of points, say less but really delve into them and focus on contextualizing your evaluation points. So don't just say it has ecological validity, specifically link that to the content of the essay. And in the YouTube video which I watched that really helped me, as I said, I'll link it down below, she talks more about this, so if you don't quite understand what I'm saying, maybe watch that video. The other thing is to use the words contribution and sufficient. This is going to sound really random, but these are words that are really good for the end of the essay. So for example, you can say like a theory can be a good contribution to psychology, like a good start, a good direction to go in, but it can be not sufficient to explain a human behavior entirely, and more research needs to be done. But yeah, I use those two words to round off my essays quite a lot, especially when it was like a theory that was very early in psychology. So yeah, those two words can be very useful. And then the last thing which my psychology teacher hammered us down about, and that is that you need a good balance of both positive and negative points. In the examiner's reports, they always say the same thing, and that it's in the essays that the students always list all the bad things about the theory and about the research. Because when it says evaluate, a lot of people just take that as criticize, but it's not just criticize, it's also what's good about this, because there is so much that's so good in psychology and we need to recognize that as well. So they get really annoyed, apparently, the examiners, when they read an essay and it's just negative point after negative point about a theory. Put in the positives as well and sort of make sure it's balanced and almost have an argument, have a debate, like there's this that's good, but this actually is a bit bad. However, out of that, this can come. So like just sort of make sure that you have positive points as well. Okay, so the very last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of psychology revision is research methods. When you add up all of the marks that are research methods marks out of all 3 papers, research methods makes up about 1/3 of the psychology course. That is huge. 1/3 of your marks are coming from research methods. That's like, that can make the difference between a C grade and an A grade. So basically, don't neglect research methods and say, oh, it's fine, I know it. Spend a good amount of time doing it, because in paper 2, it's worth half the paper, and research methods creeps up in every single exam. So make sure that you know the content well, first of all. The other thing is just do loads of practice papers for research methods. There's not really, you can't really just sit and revise off of your notes for research methods. Like, notes are even a bit hard to make, I think, for research methods. But yeah, know all of the terminology, know what it means in research methods. And the other thing is do practice papers, but especially practice questions on the statistics stuff right at the end of the specification, because that is a bit confusing. So yeah, I think that's everything for how I revise psychology. If you have any questions, do put them in the comments down below and I will try to answer as many of them as I can. But yeah, I think with any A-level, it's just about persistence. Like, at first, you're not going to get it and you're going to find certain things hard, and sometimes you will actually feel like you're hitting a wall and you're not progressing, but just keep at it, because eventually you're gonna have that epiphany moment and everything's gonna make sense. And yeah, I feel like I'm just rambling now, so thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this helped, and good luck for year 12 or year 13, whatever year you're in. Believe in yourself, because you can do it. And yeah, I hope you have a lovely day. Bye. Mwah.